We're talking about the argument from design. Now, over the last few months, I've argued that we can see signs of design in the laws that govern the operation of our universe, in the specific location of our planet within that universe, and inside the cell in what are called molecular machines. Now, today I'm going to take one more look inside the cell, but this time we're going to be talking about DNA. When we were talking about molecular machines, I gave you a version of the design argument that had been proposed by Douglas Groothuis that was specifically adapted for those molecular machines. Now, Dr. Groothuis also gave us a version that's specifically adapted for DNA, and it goes like this. Premise 1. DNA contains genetic information in the form of language. Premise 2. This genetic information is an example of specified complexity, i.e. it is contingent, complex, and specified. Premise 3. Specified complexity cannot be explained on the basis of chance or necessity, or the combination of chance and necessity. Premise 4. Intelligent agency is a known cause that produces specified and complex information. Conclusion: therefore, the best explanation of the origin of specified complexity in DNA is intelligent design. So what is DNA? DNA is a tiny double helix structure inside the cell that contains an enormous amount of information encoded as sequenced chemicals, which biologists represent by the letters A, C, T, and G. These chemicals get arranged in specific sequences, and those sequences form the instructions to assemble 20 amino acids into proteins. Now, these proteins form the molecular machines that we've been talking about for the past few weeks. So to put it more simply, DNA is a construction manual. It's the instructions for how to put together the most fundamental building blocks that are necessary for life. It's a language. It doesn't just resemble language, it is language. DNA contains instructions, just like any manual you'd get telling you how to assemble a new piece of furniture or a recipe for making Grandma's famous chocolate chip cookies. And it's not reducible to its physical components either. In other words, there's something more to DNA than just the chemicals that make it up. Douglas Groothuis gives the example of 3 words: Doug loves Rebecca. Now, we may see this message typed up on a computer screen, written down on a piece of paper, or even drawn out in the sand by a stick. Now, each of these 3 examples has completely different physical components, but the underlying information conveyed by each is identical. The same is true of DNA. It's more than just the physical chemicals. It's a message with specific content. And that's where we see the evidence for design. The late biologist George C. Williams pointed out that we can speak of physical objects having qualities like mass, charge, length, or width. But you can't describe information that way. Natural selection by definition only describes the physical. So even if we assume for the sake of argument that natural selection could explain the origin of those chemicals that make up DNA, it still can't explain where that information content comes from. But the case for design in DNA isn't just a negative one. There's also strong positive evidence for it. Philosopher of science Stephen Meyer points out, we have repeated experience of rational and conscious agents, in particular ourselves, generating or causing increases in complex specified information. Our experience-based knowledge of information flow confirms that systems with large amounts of specified complexity, especially codes and language, invariably originate from an intelligent source, from a mind or personal agent. In other words, we know where information like what we see in DNA comes from. It comes from intelligent minds. Groothuis gave the example of the Rosetta Stone, a large stone discovered in 1799 that had 3 versions of the same decree carved onto it. 2 were in different forms of Egyptian script, while the 3rd was in ancient Greek. Now, having 3 copies of the same text side by side in 3 different languages has worked wonders in helping scholars learn about and translate these ancient tongues, particularly Egyptian hieroglyphs. But when it was discovered, nobody looked at the Rosetta Stone and thought for one moment that it might have been caused by some natural law or random chance event. Why not? I mean, plenty of stones have been discovered that had all sorts of scratch marks on them. But the key here is that these weren't just any old scratch marks. These were complex markings that conveyed information. Anyone who looks at the Rosetta Stone would assume it was created by intelligent human minds, precisely because it contains recognizable information. DNA contains far more complex specified information than the Rosetta Stone. Yet so many people today will do intellectual somersaults to avoid arriving at the same logically consistent conclusion. If the most likely explanation for the Rosetta Stone is intelligent design, then that goes even more so for the information we find in DNA. So in addition to the laws and constants of our universe, our particular placement within the universe, and molecular machines inside the cell, we also find evidence of an intelligent designer inside the very DNA that acts as the instruction manual to build each and every one of us. Before we move on from the design argument, I want to spend one last week discussing a common objection. Specifically, if God really did design all life on Earth, then why are there so many examples in which, frankly, it seems like he just did a bad job of it? In other words, why are there design flaws? We'll talk about that next week. Until then, God bless.